So what I plan to do today is kind of lay out how the whole uprising is going and then touch on the Islamic characteristics that are going on, because we're hearing that increasingly used as an argument on both sides, whether it's among American politicians or whether it's even Assad's own arguments that he's using again. And we're just talking about the Russian arms sales of gunships. Looking at today, you have, depending on the source you're quoting, between 11,000 to 14,000 deaths since the protests began in March 2011. That is obviously an appalling amount. The regime, when this began, the Assad regime, it used to manage the death toll. It would kind of tell its troops around 30 was the amount you could kill in a given day. There were no use of gunships in the beginning. It was sniper fire. This was testing the international community to see at what level of violence could the regime use and kind of slide this in under the radar. As in many things with the Assad regime since Bashar came to power, he has not faced really consequences. He's not faced difficult choices. So when it comes to these tests, he has increased. Now they're using gunships. Now there are much more tank fire. Now you're dealing with hundreds of death, massacres, such as you've seen in Hula. And still, knowing that there's a presidential election here, knowing that there was a French presidential election, and incidentally, the French are now calling for military intervention while we're not, he's really begun to realize that he can really do anything he wants to do. And that's an important lesson. We have to understand that the protest, excuse me, is sustained by a population of 23 million people. This is the youngest population in the Middle East outside of the Palestinian Authority. That population doubled in 25 years, from 5.3 million in 1963 to 10.6 in 1986, and it's more than doubled again in the last quarter century. If you look at the population, 60% of Syrians are below the age of 20. Half the population is below the age of 15. There are no opportunities for them, and they're in the streets to stay. And although 70% of Syria's population is Sunni Muslims, it is Assad, who is an Alawi, from the 12% minority sect, and they're the ones who are holding power. The minority groups, about 30% of Syria is made up of minority groups. These really are holding sway as to where the protest movement's going to go. There's Shia, only 2%. Christians are 10%, and they've remained fairly loyal to Assad right now. And that's because they look at their co-religionists in Iraq and they see how they've been treated. They look at the situation with Christians in Egypt. They're not anxious to have a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated government. So we're left basically with a war between the Sunni population and the Alawi regime and the Alawi officer corps. The employment of the Shabiha, which is the ghost troops, these are thugs, kind of like the Basiji in Iran. They are unleashed on cities right now, and they're doing most of these massacres right now. And Bashar, you hear people talk about the strength of Assad's army right now. He's had to purge so much of the army. He's basically relying on his 4th Division, which is run by his brother, and it's the only one that he can say is 100% loyal to him. It's the 4th Brigade, and it's run by Mahar. When you look at the sectarian nature of this conflict right now, you see the massacres in Hula, the one in Al-Kubayr, and you see that these are villages that are adjacent to Alawi villages. And what he's trying to do is to create massacres to prevent the Alawi, his own sect, from defecting. He's creating the condition where it is absolutely sectarian, where the Alawis will know that they are just going to be massacred by Sunnis should they decide to step down. So there's also a Salafi Islamist dimension now. Early on in the demonstrations, most of the indigenous Salafi Sunni movements in Syria were penetrated by the regime and focused against enemies in Iraq and Lebanon. And we have to remember that Syria is responsible for sending the bulk of foreign fighters to kill coalition forces in Iraq. So they were using them, and now they're coming home to roost. In fact, just last month, Panetta was saying that we know that there's Al-Qaeda there, we just don't know exactly what their activities are. So there are some Al-Qaeda elements coming back, and this is to be expected, but the numbers are far, far overblown. And that's in, obviously, Assad's interest to say that, look, I'm dealing with al-Qaeda and foreign elements. The protest movement is overwhelmingly homegrown. There are other reports, like from AQI crossing the borders. They're using the same networks. Al-Qaeda leader Ayman Zawahiri issued a statement on February 11th. He's urged Muslims inside and outside of Syria to fight against the Syrian government. And again, with Assad blaming foreign elements, he is still trying to cast this as Islamist militants and al-Qaeda-affiliated cells. While al-Qaeda may be present, Assad is significantly overstating their presence in the country. So the estimated size of the insurgency right now is about 18,000 fighters, and foreign fighters currently make up about 4 to 7% of that total. So it is worth noting that the Assad regime has identified only around 40 individuals as jihadists, according to the list that Damascus sent to the UN in May. Nevertheless, a sharp increase in suicide bombings can be seen since January, including a May 10th double suicide bombing, which killed 55. There is the birth of a homegrown indigenous terrorist group, a Salafi group. This is not a foreign group. It is Jabhat al-Nusra, the Victory Front, and they've been claiming responsibility for many of these attacks. Whenever these attacks go on, Assad tries to cast them again as something related to al-Qaeda, which they're not.
Can you just say which attacks you're talking about? You're not talking about the massacres. You're talking
I'm not talking about the massacres. I'm talking about the suicide bombings that have happened, and a lot of people who are against intervening will try to say that these Salafi groups are the same people as the Syrian National Council or the Free Syrian Army, and so they're all just one giant, group together, and so supporting intervention would then be supporting Salafi terrorists. But this group, Jabhat al-Nusra, they're the ones carrying out the suicide bombings, as different from the massacres where you see the shootings and in the villages. Since January, they've been taking credit, and since its creation, the group's media output, which is issued now by its own media group, has grown in both quantity and quality as the terrorist attacks they claim credit for have grown in sophistication and lethality. So as the uprising continues, the opportunities for Takfiri cells and al-Qaeda offshoots and indigenous Salafi groups to coalesce into larger terrorist organizations, it becomes a much greater reality. But at the moment, they really are a minority. So it's important to note the longer this goes on, the more potential for Syria turning into jihad central. So when we talk about who we would support if we were to intervene in any way, we're talking about the Free Syrian Army. Now, they're founded by Colonel Riyad al-Assad, no relation to the other Assad. That was founded in July 2011, and that was formed in order to protect civilians. It's former security officers, irregular armed thugs, or irregular gang members in that, basically, but it's usually from the army. It's Syrian soldiers, believed to have between 30 to 50,000. I think 18,000 is probably the best estimate. They have support from abroad right now, and the support they're getting is from Qatar, from Yemen, from Saudi Arabia, but they're also getting support from wealthy Salafi clerics at the moment. So these are the people who are pumping in money to the Free Syrian Army. They're pumping in the weapons, while we are not really having a stake in this at the moment. So I'm going to give some reasons to intervene, because the longer this goes on, the worse the scenario looks. Iran remains the big game in town. We want to deprive Iran of Syria, which is its greatest ally. We want to prevent the Shia crescent from Iran to the Mediterranean Sea. We would like to constrain Hezbollah. So knowing that Obama came to office with an engagement strategy with Iran and an engagement strategy with Syria to rehabilitate Syria, it would just make the most amount of sense that if you have a country that has acted very much as your enemy, that you would like to have them removed from power and have a say in the outcome. So it is better to have a say in the future of the Syrian state than leaving it to the radical Islamists in the Gulf. And providing some assistance will give us a chance to influence now and to influence the post-Assad state after. Staying on the sidelines also gives Russia the ability to play a regional power broker, supporting Assad along with Iran. The U.S. has an interest in seeing that that doesn't happen as well. And again, Russia will stick with Iran in Syria because that's what makes Russia look like a power broker, and we're allowing this to happen. Syria is thought to have hundreds of tons of chemicals and biological weapons, including sarin and VX. The longer the fighting continues, the less likely the regime will be able to control these weapons and the WMDs, and they may disappear into the hands of Hezbollah, as other weapons are currently disappearing into the hands of Hezbollah. The longer the uprising continues, the more likely the conflict will become regionalized, spilling over into Lebanon, as it already is. Assad could use Palestinian refugees, try flooding them across the border toward Israel, toward Jordan, which is also going through a period of instability. It becomes more likely that it will turn into a regional conflict, pitting Iran against Turkey. That's something we don't want to see either. Also, the longer this continues, the more likely, as I said, Syria will become jihad central, as Islamist terrorists will continue to flock to the country. Now, President Obama called on Assad to step aside back in August, but he's been unable to make that happen. In fact, the White House has backtracked by going with the ill-conceived so-called Annan plan, which does not call for Assad to resign even. So Washington's inability to compel Assad's departure poses a threat to American credibility and the perception of American power in the region. And lastly, allies and adversaries can sense the administration's weakness right now. If the U.S. cannot be trusted to lead the world against the Assad regime, indeed if the world fails to intervene, then there is no reason for Iran to fear American action, and there's no reason for Israel to believe that the world or the U.S. would come to its defense against Iran. In fact, the Obama administration keeps saying that Syria's military is a formidable force protected by a Russian air defense system. In fact, it is a weak and splintered group now, and it operates as a sectarian militia that can't even defeat the ragtag Free Syrian Army. So this just shows right now remarkable U.S. weakness. And I'll leave it to questions now.
Great. Matt, thank you very much. Two that occur to me that you might address, and then we'll open it up. One is Iran, as you say, is kind of the big game at the moment. And I certainly get the idea that things that weaken Iran would be good. But on the other hand, things that preoccupy us, instead of actually addressing the Iranian threat itself, can be a deflection that may, in fact, buy the Iranians time to finish their nuclear programs. That and the stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction and how you see them transitioning from their present control to something else are two. And I know some of these are things that you may not have an answer for, but I'd like you to address them a little bit more if you would.
Okay, on the second part, the weapons are currently held by divisions of the Syrian army. So the faster you can make a transition to whatever would be next, which wouldn't be like was done in Iraq, just getting rid of the entire army, you would still have sections of the army in control of the weapons. As you have more jihadists move in and they're going to have a different plan for the future, it's not hard to envision them doing suicide attacks and carrying these out against those type of targets to try to get their hands on those kind of weapons. Specifically, a lot of these Salafi groups right now have a stake very much in what is happening in Lebanon. When you look at Fatah al-Islam in Lebanon versus Hezbollah, which is Shia, these weapons would love to be played out over there. And it's not hard to envision that happening when you look at these Salafi groups and their ties to al-Qaeda in Iraq, and looking at down the road in the future where you could see them coalescing into a much greater, larger group. So the speed with which we take care of this is better. The doing nothing plan right now is going to, it leads in a bad direction. Your first part was?
Well, just on that, the intervention that you're thinking of involves taking on the Syrian army, doesn't it?
The intervention that I would talk about is first heightening the economic pressure that we're doing, and I don't think in the end that's going to make a difference. Convincing this 30% minority groups that we're talking about, the Syrian Sunni business community, that they have a stake in the future, they should stop. That's on economics. If you're talking about anything with force, the most I would say we would do is set up a no-fly zone, and work with Turkey to do that, work along the borders with Jordan, create a place where we can talk to the Free Syrian Army, train the Free Syrian Army, and give them weapons, give them intelligence. I mean, If the Free Syrian, it's a game of whack-a-mole, as it's been called, because with the splintering of Assad's army, he can't even take on the Free Syrian Army right now. So if we give them training and intelligence, I'm sure that it wouldn't be necessarily the quickest defeat, but it would be a way forward, and it gives us the opportunity to influence the politics and the outcome. I mean, you have the Free Syrian Army that's inside the country, the Syrian National Council, that's the exiled grouping that disagrees with the Free Syrian Army. We need to be working with these groups to create a political platform that is not, say, supported by Qatari, Yemeni, and Saudi sheikhs on like an individual level.
Okay. We'll come back to Iran. Travis?
Hi, Travis Corson, Center for Security Policy. I had two questions. The first one was regarding the no-fly zone. Just this morning, the Pentagon released that they have finished drawing up their contingency plans for Syria. They obviously have.
Can you believe it took this long? They started looking at it, I think they said in January.
They obviously haven't released what they are, but one of the more serious obstacles to operating in Syria are the air defenses, which are much more sophisticated than they are in Libya. So how would that factor into a no-fly zone? My second question was the Russian helicopters, and they were saying they weren't new, they were out for repair. And if you could just kind of elaborate on that, and should the Russians have given them back? If not, should they have held them? Kind of what are your thoughts on that as well?
Russia should not be selling arms, period, to Syria. I mean, it's the idea that we wasted a year thinking that we would engage in diplomacy with Russia, and then at the Security Council, they would help us. I have an article in the Huffington Post, I think that was passed out here, on Russia's role. They are just not going to be helpful at all. So the U.S. would have to make a decision to judge Russia based on what it's doing in Syria, what it's doing in Iran. From my personal perspective, I think it's fairly hard to make the case that Russia has been helpful anywhere since we've tried the reset. So, I mean, there's not like one success we could trade off of. So that's a decision that any administration would have to make. As far as the air defense system, yeah, it's really not that sophisticated. I mean, I know everyone says it is, but this is a really bad army. You can look at, I don't know if it was taken off the internet. It was Karafan, who was a Syrian blogger, who would talk about, he was in the army, and he would talk about just how bad the Syrian defense systems are. Like, they would sit by their SAM systems and knowing full well that if they turn it on, they're going to be just bombed to eternity. Number one. Number two, Israel, I think it was 2003, buzzed the Assad's palace, Latakia, no problem. Syria had no idea in 2007, it's obviously thought to have been Israel that blew up their nuclear reactor. They flew in, flew out, no problem. Those are Israeli jets. I don't think it would be a problem for the United States. I think it's scary if the United States thinks that it's going to be a problem to take out those type of weapon systems. Worse would be this conflict dragging out, SA-2s, SA-6s, all these SAM systems, portable manpads, going into Hezbollah, being transferred to a whole bunch of other groups with nefarious ideas.
It would seem to me that if we're working with the Free Syrian Army, if we could say to them, what do you need us to do to help level the playing field? When they give us that information, steam one of our aircraft carriers into the Mediterranean, have it stationed in international waters, and then have a number of sorties. You could do it in a weekend to strike specific Syrian military targets, especially those that are run by Assad's brother. I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, wouldn't that have a positive effect?
I think it would have a very positive effect. And then you're not talking about American boots on the ground. You're not talking about a long campaign. You're making the case that America is strong, and as leadership, you're serving notice to Iran. If you're an Iranian negotiator now in the nuclear program, why would you give up anything at all? Like, would you possibly think the United States is going to do something as we're redeploying however much percentage of our assets are to Asia? I mean, there's no bring a ship into the Mediterranean. You can do that. I mean, there's no reason why we're not deploying another carrier group toward the Gulf to send a message. You know, we can negotiate, but at the same time, we're very serious. So the threat to America, as far as our military is concerned, I think is very much overblown.
Warren?
This was, you recall back in the Reagan administration, Libya tried to challenge the United States, and then we shot 2 or 3 of their planes out of the sky, and Libya and Gaddafi stood down after that.
Right. The difference here, Assad is not as big of a loon as Gaddafi. Number one, and number two, Assad knows that this is it for him. I mean, the way he's made the sectarian conflict to draw that out is, number one, because the rest of the world around him is saying, oh no, it'll turn into a sectarian conflict. So he wants everything to look like Al-Qaeda. He wants everything to look extremely sectarian. So he wants everyone to know that it's going to be his community that pays for it. So he is going to fight till the end. And number two, he's managed to annoy enough of the Arab leaders that it's very unlikely that he would be offered the 40-year plan. Well, the 40-year plan is not the, why don't you and your wife come over here and you can stay for a little bit. It's the plan that in 5 years, an assassin doesn't kind of break into your house and shoot you. That kind of security. It doesn't look like there is any regime right now that is going to offer him that. And increasingly, it looks like Saudi Arabia, who may have at some point earlier on, just sees this now as a proxy war where Iran has jumped in, Russia has jumped in, and no one is jumping in on the other side except for those who are, supporting terrorist movements.
Anybody else? Christine?
I actually have 2 questions. One, what is your view on local military, the Saudis, let's say, rather than the U.S., maintaining your no-fly zone? They certainly have plenty of U.S. aircraft, and now Saudi aircraft, U.S. sold. Jordan certainly has some limited capability. Again, with U.S. military cooperation, there's a lot of co-training that's already gone on in those places for regional purposes. So that's one question. The second question is, what do you think the regime would look like if we did intervene successfully, assuming that some resolution is made between the Free Army and the Syrian National Congress and the other organizations? And what would be the status at that point of the minorities, either Alawite or, in my view, I'm particularly interested in Christian?
I think by now, getting involved, we would have to be making the case to Alawites, to Christians, to generals, to the business community, that you'll have a stake in the future, as far a future post-Assad regime. As far as working out politically what it would look like, that's incredibly hard to say. The Syrian National Council is obviously dominated by the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, but they're essentially all in exile. It's not like in Egypt where they were underground and there. They were basically, it's capital punishment to be a member of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. So the U.S. would have to be working with as many secular groups and even, Muslim groups. I mean, this is just the reality of the Middle East in trying to shape what the future is going to be. A difference between Egypt, aside from the sectarian divide, is really the population of Syria finds the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood to be quite distasteful. They still remember the 80s, from 76 to 82, the uprising that they brought and the massacres that Hafez al-Assad brought on them, and they blame that firmly on the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. Still, even though it's likely that there would be a Muslim-tinged government in the future, it would be Sunni, not naturally allied with Iran, which I think is a better outcome. And I think Islam is going to end up being a part of Middle Eastern governments. So it's up to us to work with them. As far as Saudi Arabia and Turkey and other countries contributing to a military force, obviously that would be great. The only reason that doesn't happen is because it kind of never will. They haven't, I mean, Turkey could. It's impossible, it's unlikely to see Saudi Arabia contributing in that way. I mean, as part of if the U.S. leads, then they can build up a coalition and something like that can happen. It's unfortunately too much of a fantasy to think that the Arab League would actually be able to take over and do something. But they're really, really good at sitting around tables, talking, yelling, and arguing, and really not.
Let me ask you again, Matt, the question on getting ourselves embroiled in a sideshow, important as it is, when we're, at least I think at the government level, anxious to avoid focusing on the real problem, which is, I think you would agree, is Iran. I have to tell you, I'm less sanguine than you are about our ability to work with some of these Islamist governments, as you call them, especially since I think that the Brotherhood is pretty clear that they're actually quite hostile to us. But even if you believe that you can get a good outcome out of Syria, it is going to take time and resources and probably military wherewithal that I would much rather see applied to addressing the more serious problem of Iran. What's your response on that?
My response is I agree. I think we should be able to address both. I think Iran and Syria are the two Middle East biggest, longest standing threats to the United States, and they've acted as enemies. So working to take care of both. I mean, and again, by getting strong against Syria now, it will send a direct message to Iran. It will affect the region. Also, the current administration, I have no reason to believe, is going to do anything about Iran. So if they don't do anything about Iran and then Syria continues as it is, we have the worst of all possibilities. If we had a strong posture on Iran right now, that might be a little bit different, but still, I think you can take care of Syria quicker, not advocating, again, boots on the ground. And you could take care of air defense systems quicker. It's not the same kind of like Iraq nation building that we had seen before. So I just don't see it as being embroiled in something for an incredibly long period of time that would distract us from Iran.